Hello, dear friends. Today we continue our acquaintance with the surprisingly candid memoirs of the Wehrmacht general. He began to write in his diary less frequently, and the chronology of events will now accelerate. As you can see, he now describes his thoughts on the war as a whole, rather than on the specific section of the front entrusted to him. I think it will be incredibly interesting to learn his opinion on the course of the war, because his view of events is quite insightful and honest. Don't forget to rate the video, and let's get started. October 10th, 1942. Diary entry. The Harvest Festival, as Count Moy said, psychologically hit the mark in terms of controlling the Russian people. By transferring churches to the population, giving speeches, distributing food, holding festive demonstrations, and organizing a folk festival with singing, dancing, and games, which ended with a movie screening, we largely swayed public opinion in our favor. The general attitude became more friendly and open. Germans can not only work, they also know how to celebrate, said the Russians. Now they greet us repeatedly, some with a raised hand. The idea of holding a harvest festival came to the Count. We hope that this will help counter the threat of guerrilla warfare. This example shows how easy it is to influence Russians if you meet this emotional people halfway and help them a little. It is very interesting that Professor Zilla, in a recent report, defended a point of view on Russians that coincides with ours. Russia should be conquered only together with them, not against their will. Whoever controls the people controls Russia. But I think this is difficult to achieve. Of course, there are many people here who, being enemies of Bolshevism, do not accept present-day Russia. But there are still more Russians who, despite everything, remain staunch opponents of Germany and the Germans. October 13th. Diary entry. It seems that the street fighting in Stalingrad, which had paused briefly, is now continuing. Near Grozny, it seems that the intention to conquer the oil-producing region has been abandoned, as it has been set on fire by aerial bombardment. Such a refusal seems to me a bitter loss. We are undoubtedly short of fuel. It seems that we are advancing calmly on Tuapse in the Caucasus. Perhaps we will still be able to take this important port. The attack on Leningrad has apparently been abandoned. They are content with the fact that the Russian breakthrough has been stifled. When those who fought here a year ago compare those times with the present, they see that last October we had the right of first move in our hands. We attacked and pushed the Russians back everywhere, convinced that we could do it. Today the initiative is again in Russian hands. We are expecting their attack, with forces superior to ours. But it seems that all is not well on the other side either. Stalin's new call to open a second front and the abolition of the institution of commissars, who are now being retrained as officers, suggest that things are not looking rosy there. The loss of territory and human casualties have a strong effect both in terms of the economy and in terms of reserves. But the Russians will certainly hold out until spring, and will attack at the latest when a second front is opened in the west, or in Norway. Perhaps they will do so in our sector earlier, namely in winter. It will definitely be to our advantage if there is a lot of snow, as this will complicate any attack. November 5th, 1942. Diary entry. Overall conclusion. The war has not yet been won, but there is no reason for despondency. In military terms and in terms of supplies, the situation is satisfactory. Although there are some problematic situations, for example with fuel. In the occupied territories, the general mood seems bleak. Everyone is really suffering hardship right now. Everyone is hoping for the victory of our enemies. The mood is not in our favor. November 8th. Diary entry. In the afternoon, news that the Americans and British have landed in West Africa and Morocco. What a damn nuisance. In East Africa, Rommel is badly battered and under heavy pressure, and in West Africa, a fresh enemy army has appeared. It may be far from Rommel, perhaps 2,000 kilometers, but who is going to drive them out of there? The war is getting interesting again, says my chief of staff. I must say, I am very grateful for such an introduction. This is indeed the second front we were promised, but in a direction that still surprised me. November 10th, diary entry. If Africa is lost, then the Mediterranean is finished. It will be a heavy blow, because we fought so hard for Mare Nostrum. What will the Italians say if the areas that are now turning the kingdom into an empire are lost? And what position will the French take when they take their North Africa? I think it's impossible that France will fight on our side against its old allies. On the contrary, it seems likely to me that one day Pétain's government will simply be removed. A second front has been opened on our weakest flank, Italy. Our enemies hope to knock Italy out of the Axis powers. With Mussolini as prime minister, it will be difficult for them to do so. But it is possible that he too will fall. Africa was a continuation of the new Europe. Today, I see no way to win it back if it is lost. Given these circumstances, was it right to start the Russian campaign? I still lean toward a negative answer. We should have made them our allies, even at the cost of the Dardanelles. This war in Russia has absorbed so many German forces and is tying up most of them. November 13th, diary entry. While battles are being fought for continents, we have to ask the Führer's permission to withdraw a single battalion. We must free his mind from such minor details. Why does he need an army group or an army then? In that case, mannequins could fulfill our role here. November 23rd, diary entry. The alien, backward medieval culture of Russia. No, this is not our Europe, but literally another continent. If it weren't for the bloody and terrible seriousness of the war behind all this, even despite Bolshevism, one could admire the beauty of nature. This is November, with its dry cold and bright sun, much better than the cloudy and damp November in Berlin or Königsberg. While everything is calm here, impressive events are unfolding in the south. The Russians broke through the Romanian troops flanking Stalingrad on both sides and advanced 70 kilometers deep into the rear. Evidently, their preparations for the offensive went unnoticed, giving the impression that this strike was as sudden as the landing in French Africa. According to the latest reports, as of this evening, Paulus's Sixth Army is surrounded at Stalingrad. This is not just unpleasant, but very bad. It does not appear that we have sufficient reserves at our disposal to quickly pull them out of the encirclement. December 1st, 1942. Diary entry. Yesterday, the Chief of Staff calculated that if we retreat to the shortened front line proposed by the Field Marshal, cutting off the excess corners, this would free up the entire Ninth Army, which has about 23 divisions. And then the divisions in position would have defense sectors half as long as our current ones. The mild autumn would have provided an excellent opportunity to establish excellent positions, and the accessibility of the roads would have ensured the best possible retreat. How happy the High Command would be if they now had 23 more divisions at their disposal, almost as many as the entire Army Group North. But now the moment has been missed. The art of war is a little more complicated than a street fight. The time will come when this will become clear to everyone, because such mistakes will have to be paid for. And if that time comes too late, it will all end very badly. Perhaps the Chief of the General Staff should be the first to speak up, not obsequiously bowing to the opinion of his superiors, but on the contrary, objecting quite clearly. This cannot go on. December 27th, diary entry. Glotterbad. Of course, the enemy also has many losses, but Russia plus England plus America, and they should be considered not separately but as a joint triple force, can still bear the losses more easily than we can. After all, the strain on our German forces is already unprecedented, especially when you look at the theaters of war spread across Europe and North Africa. To cope with this, new units are constantly being created at the will of the Führer. Existing units are suffering as a result. They are not receiving sufficient reinforcements in manpower and equipment, and therefore cannot be as effective. The airfield divisions currently being formed are a particular stumbling block. In a sense, Göring created them out of nothing. They are very well armed, but their training is poor, and they behave like green recruits. There are cries from all sides that we must supply them with training personnel. If these airfield divisions were incorporated into the ranks of the existing army, then we could once again bring the personnel of many divisions up to 9 battalions. We could strengthen the artillery, that is, significantly increase our combat power. Then these Luftwaffe mechanics would have a foundation of already trained units, which would gradually turn them into real soldiers. But of course, none of this will happen, because the Luftwaffe also needs its own special army, just like the SS. And all at the expense of the regular army. However, this development even gives me a certain satisfaction. When I was working on the issue of military service in the ministry in 1936 and 1937, I fought against inflated budgets for the Luftwaffe, which was overloading itself with personnel. Of course, the struggle was unsuccessful. January 7th, 1943. Report to the family. The Christmas tree and manger are now 2,500 kilometers away from me. I fondly remember the glorious days I was able to spend in their splendor in Glotterbad. Nevertheless, the return trip to Spaz-Demensk became a kind of homecoming. The longer the trip lasted, the more I looked forward to arriving at our little house there and diving back into my usual work. Our castle in Condé, France, where we were staying, seemed so grand at the time, and the wooden hut near the church in Spaz-Demensk became so cozy for us. January 22nd. Diary entry. In the evening, I visited Field Marshal von Kluge on his special train, where he spent the night after an unsuccessful hunt for moose, foxes, and wolves in the area of the 137th Division. The evening was particularly pleasant. Face to face, we discussed the general situation on the Eastern Front. It is changing with frightening speed. There is no hope for the liberation of Stalingrad. There is a great risk that the armies fighting in the Caucasus will be cut off. The successes of the summer offensive have been almost completely nullified. A truly terrible and extremely distressing situation. How long will it be before it begins to affect us? When I stopped in Berlin on January 3rd on my way back from vacation to visit Colonel General Fromm, he said to me, "What fantasies these people live in." On December 12th, Field Marshal Keitel sat in this chair and said, "The Russians are no longer capable of conducting offensive operations of operational significance." It seems that at the very top, wishful thinking is taken for reality. Of course, an optimistic view of things is not a bad thing, but it should not completely obscure the real situation. I fear that everything is determined by the Führer, before whom no one wants to appear hesitant. We have had many examples of the leadership misjudging Russia. Underestimation of Russian weaponry and the capabilities of the Russian armed forces. During the last meeting in Warsaw, shortly before the start of the campaign, the former military attaché in Moscow was asked to assess the state of the Red Army, and he said of their officer corps, "They are at the level of non-commissioned officers from the worst German company." Reduction in the production of ammunition and weapons in July 1941. Resources were diverted to the manufacture of submarines and Luftwaffe programs, as it was assumed that the Red Army had already been defeated and the campaign was coming to an end. The result was a significant shortage of the above in the winter of 1941/42. The Führer's speech on the occasion of the start of the Winter Relief Campaign in 1941. The Russian army has lost 11, I think that was the figure, million killed, wounded, and captured. Even the strongest army cannot withstand such losses, and that means the Russian army too. Statement by Reich Press Chief Dietrich in late October or early November 1941. The outcome of the war in Russia is clear. Political reasons also played a role here, as did the desire to encourage Japan to enter the war. Those of us who were at the front at the time were simply stunned when we heard this statement and compared it with what we were experiencing. Assessment of the enemy's situation before the Battle of Vyazma, October 2, 1941. The High Command of the Land Forces stated that the Russians had only 10 to 12 divisions in operational reserve. Destroy them, and it would all be over. There was a constant expectation that Russia's military potential would be significantly weakened if several distant targets were achieved, which was done during the offensive in the south in 1942. Without mentioning tanks and aircraft at all, the High Command of the Land Forces recently acknowledged that Russia was able to make up for its incredible losses in artillery in 1941. The Führer's point of view, expressed in my presence at headquarters on February 28, 1942. 1942 will be the last year of tank use. Our superior anti-tank defenses will defeat this weapon every time, and it will disappear as an instrument of warfare. Similarly, he then declared publicly, the internal political situation in England is the same as it was in Germany in 1918. It is in a state of progressive decay. All in all, there are so many misjudgments of the enemy that it must be regretfully acknowledged that the defeat, which is gradually approaching, in the southern direction, occurred, among other things, through no fault of our own. In this regard, I would like to recall another statement made by Field Marshal Keitel during the armistice negotiations in France in 1940 or shortly thereafter. The war has been won. Now all that remains is to finish it. Probably guided by a similar approach, they moved against Russia, assuming that this campaign would also be over in a few weeks. I know that the Gauleiters of Moscow and Tiflis had already been appointed in advance. They say that a commission is still sitting in Berlin, waiting to be sent there. Because of this internal conviction, our leadership saw no reason not to send almost exclusively Hungarians, Italians, and Romanians to the Don front, which was probably strong in the summer, stretching them out over hundreds of kilometers of the front. They decided that the Russians had probably exhausted their offensive potential. Now the latter defeated the former in a matter of hours, breaking through where there were no German divisions. I will never forget how in mid-August we held a farewell party for General von Holtitz, who was then acting commander of the 265th Division. At lunch, someone asked him, "Where would you like to be assigned now?" When he replied, "To the south," my chief of staff said, "Be careful. It is better to stay in the area of Army Group Center or the Second Army, but not to go south. When the Russian offensive begins, it will have to pass through Italian-occupied territory in the direction of Rostov. And then, I wouldn't want to be south of that area. Otherwise, you might have to cross the Black Sea." That's how we assessed the situation in August. That's all for today. If you liked the video, please support it with a like and subscribe to the channel. See you all soon.